You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Avraham Kivelevitz, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Clear the aisles, the Projectionist, Semicha. Hi, I'm here with Kolakowski and his definitely better half, Chavah.
The amazing thing about the Lawrence Welk show is that every single one of the shows was aired live originally and then recorded as it aired live for syndication. So when you're watching these episodes, you can see the high level of musicianship, high quality of the dancing. I mean, it's like perfection, you know. They don't have takes to get these musical numbers and dance numbers down. They had 1 week to rehearse and they better have it down. And they pull it through every single time. And you can tell when there's something that happens because they ad-lib, but they're such consummate performers. They're so talented. It seems like it's part of the show, and it's really, I always got into it. I don't know what attracted me to it initially as a child, but my mother used to bribe me to do things like, oh, if you pick up your toys, you can watch Lawrence Welk. And I would totally fell for that. So I still do that to myself.
Of course, that was, the show went off the air, I think, in 1982. I think the show went off the air. So you were watching it in reruns that were being shown on public TV, right?
Well, the original, I was born in 1977, and we're talking, I remember it being in the old house. So I moved when I was 5 from Yukon, Idaho to Idaho Falls, which was called moving in town. So I remember being in the old house and still watching it. So it was probably live then. And then as a teenager, I got back into it, and I used to come home. I took a year of courses at Idaho State University, which is in Pocatello, which is an hour away from my hometown. I used to come home just to watch Lawrence Welk with my family every Saturday. I would come home Fridays after class and stay until Sunday, but the highlight of the week was watching Lawrence Welk with my family. I know Mr. Welk was very big on tznius. Obviously the level of tznius that he has is not the level of tznius that like a Jewish community would have, but like the costumes, especially compared to like variety shows and performances of now, are very modest. Right.
And let's just give people a sense who don't remember what the program was. It wasn't it wasn't a variety show like Ed Sullivan. It was basically a music program, right? Ed Sullivan would have jugglers, ventriloquists, stand-up comics. This was a show that was pretty much music, I think, for the complete hour. There might have been, Welk did a little bit of, I guess, some sort of like intro to the program. I guess he tried to crack a joke or two, but it was mostly like big band originally. I think band music.
Yes.
And then later, he tried. I think as the show progressed, he did try. It was on for 30 years in various iterations. He did try to introduce what was more popular music. It wasn't just like old fogey music, right?
Yeah, right. So he did, and he brought in fresh blood, so to speak, performers. He still had the old timers on. But he would bring in younger performers and they would do more popular music to keep things exciting and fresh. But if you're a Lawrence Welk person, you can recognize the performers from year to year. Mm-hmm. And you get all excited when he says, well, here comes Joanne Castle to play Exodus for us. And like, you can't wait to see her, And there are dance numbers, but the dance numbers are really all about the music, as you said. Lawrence Welk was primarily his instrument was accordion, and he was also a band leader.
Right. And people talk about, Ed Sullivan's lack of personality and still the show's success. I mean, Welk, you wouldn't necessarily call him a dynamo, although he was very excited, I think, about the numbers. Like he would be and even more than the numbers, I think you hit it, what you said, Chavah. He was very supportive of his performers. He would always give them a very big compliment, like the Lennon sisters or somebody like they would come on, and he would always say, "And now we have this, right? And this, the great and wonderful dance team or whatever it was." And you could tell that they were It was not just family oriented. You could tell everybody liked each other on the show, like all the
Yeah, in fact, the PBS reruns that they play to this day on local PBS stations around the country, instead of having commercial breaks, they have host segments, basically with the original performers that are still alive, which were, the youngsters back then. And they talk about, how it was really a family. Everybody loved each other. Everybody supported each other. One of them got sick and everybody helped. And when people started to pass away.
It was occurring in the 70s. It was something similar to what was happening in the 50s and 60s in films. Just like at that period, the studios basically started to come apart and were mostly a distribution center as opposed to creations. What happened in the late 60s and 70s was that programs didn't need a network anymore. There was this idea of syndication, where the people who produced the program would just try to sell it to various outlets throughout the country. And there was another program that did very well in syndication. At the very same time, it was canceled by CBS. It was called Hee Haw, and you might remember it. It was right? So Hee Haw, right? And so Hee Haw continued its run in syndication, as did the Lawrence Welk Show. And that was, I think, what in a way what saved it and what preserved it for another 10 or 11 years. Because, clearly by 1971, and when it went off the air on ABC, they wanted, we have to have more with it fare, we have to have more cool fare. And the people who were creating the Lawrence Welk Show said, well, we think we can sell this. And it was still being shown in various television outlets throughout the country. Maybe even, even in a stronger way, than when they had to kowtow to what the network wanted. And I think that's when, from 1970, 1980, I think that's when you have this sort of cocoon-like sense of the Lawrence Welk Show, where we're not going to incorporate the type of hard rock, we're not going to incorporate the drug theme type of music. There still might be, maybe a pop tune here or there. But I think that's when it really starts to become totally bubble music, totally, completely, just the old time thing. I remember there was also, as you said, unlike a lot of the 50s and 60s programs, Chavah, where they were like American Bandstand, where you had like the kids, dancing and stuff like that. I remember in the Lawrence Welk Show, when I used to watch it, there'd be towards the end of the episode, these ballroom dancing, these couples would get up there on the stage and dance while the orchestra was playing. Do you remember that?
Right. And I think Mr. Welk himself would dance with ladies every once in a while, and you could just see the thrill on their faces. But it's never young people. In fact, my mother and father would always joke, like every time that they would show the couples dancing to the big, to the band music, they would say, all those people are dead now, because they're old back then. And when I say that Lawrence Welk in the end began to hire younger performers and perform hipper music, you're right. It was always champagne music. It was always, he always kept it light. It was always, he never did anything that was, would be considered controversial, but he did like Carpenters, adult contemporary stuff that we consider adult contemporary today. He would perform some of that stuff.
But in his way, like he'd have one of his singers do it in a different way. Which was a little bit, I guess a more saccharine-like version, I would say.
It's schmaltzy for sure. You can't gloss over that, but that's part of the appeal.
And I think, coming up from that, that section of the country, that sort of Germanic section, so polka music was, you could tell that was also something that they had a part of the program was dedicated to. I always think when I think about polka music and the Lawrence Welk show, I think about one of SCTV's greatest creations was the Shmengi brothers, where Eugene Levy.
I thought about that
when Eugene Levy and John Candy did the Shmengi brothers, which was really like taking that Lawrence Welk schmaltz to the ultimate degree. Mrs. Veriachki and her Kolakowskis, whatever it was that she was. But it was very much. It was sort of like the type of Lawrence Welk independent program that you might see in Upper Ontario in some place like that. So it was it clearly was very much open to satire if you really look at it. So why do you think part of what we try to do on this program, Chavah, is to give people ideas? So you think that there's like a good vibe you get from watching? You really think there's so many people in our audience would enjoy it or would see that like when you came on the last time, you talked about the beauty of the Archers film, The Red Shoes. Do you really think people can watch this program and marvel at the artistry and at the quality of the musicians?
I mean, sure, but there's also just the very brainless. Sometimes you want to just escape life, right? Like, I happen to have a very stressful job. I love my job, but it is very stressful, and sometimes I just want to turn on Lawrence Welk and have something light and fluffy that entertains me and takes me away for a few minutes from reality. It's very well performed. It's not going to be challenging you in any way. This is not intellectual by any means, but it's just fun. And if you can sort of expand your mind, if you're used to watching modern television and you want to try something a little bit light and fun, and it never takes itself too seriously. There's always an element, even though the performers are incredible and they're never laughing at themselves, but they're not challenging you in any way. They're not asking you to expand your mind to accept German expressionism or whatever, it's just light, fun.
Did he ever do like a Jewish medley? I think he sometimes did that. I seem to remember him saying, "Wishing all our Jewish friends a happy Hanukkah." I think I remember him saying that.
Sure.
During the Christmas season.
We were watching Lawrence Welk. I don't remember. It was right before Hanukkah. We were watching an episode of Lawrence Welk, and it was an autumn episode from the 80s. And he mentioned his friend. What was the rabbi's name, Tati? Rabbi Mag. He said, "I want to wish my friend Rabbi Magnan. He just turned 90 years old, and he's here in Hollywood celebrating Yom Kippur with his congregation." And I was like, "What?" And I had to immediately Google who's this Rabbi Magnan, and turns out he was the Hollywood rabbi, and he lived to be Kanai 96, and led the Kehillah until that age. So you can see some Jewish stuff every once in a while on there. And he does do medleys of a Chavah Nagila and stuff. Yeah. Again, it's just fun. It's just fun.
He did Fiddler on the Roof that night. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. What's interesting, is that he was no fool. Again, I don't know if he, at the end of his life, he was extremely wealthy, but I know that there's the Welk Resorts in Branson, Missouri, right? And
I can't wait. I want to go so bad.
Yeah, and of course, Branson is this, for people who don't know, is this tremendous haven for all different types of musical styles, especially bluegrass and country music. But there's actually, I guess, a place where if you go to the Welk Resort, I guess you could probably get a sense of the old one and two over there, and they might have that type of music, and it's a 4-star resort. That much I do know. So
really, wow,
it sounds like the Welk family is making some money somehow. So.
All I know is some of the real classic people like Joanne Castle, that's my girl. I want to go there and see her play so bad. It's like on my bucket list, but yeah. So
on The Simpsons, they said that Branson, Missouri is like Vegas if it was run by Ned Flanders.
Yeah, it's a Ned Flanders show.
Yeah. And that's also an aspect of the show is that he wanted people with no scandals, so he would try to get religious people. He was Catholic, but he would get Mormons and other religious people who didn't have any scandals.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a few Mormons. I know a lot of the younger performers that he hired in the late 70s and early 80s, right before it went off of live performance, or from Brigham Young University.
Right. So even though your family was Mormon, they didn't feel there was anything. They thought it was okay. Do you think did Donnie and Marie ever hang out with Lawrence Welk, or do you think that was like
that would be incredible? I don't know if that ever happened.
I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense that they would because I think Donnie and Marie, when they had their and you could probably find their episodes on YouTube, when they had their primetime show in the 80s, it was also very wholesome type of program, right? And
right.
I think it was sort of like tapping into the same thing. I think there was another element though there, which was it was sort of like a Annette Funicello type of a factor in terms of Marie. I think that was part of it. She's so beautiful and so wholesome at the same time. It's sort of like, I can't wait for her to do something a little bit pushing the envelope. I think that's part of the reason why people like Donnie and Marie. This brother and sister act, maybe in ways that, again, I don't know if it's the same audience, but I would assume that you could probably get some of that same stuff from Donnie and Marie. Although I think that was more like a classic variety show where they did comedy skits and things like that, which you're not going to find on Lawrence Welk. I think
right. So the biggest, I would say, skit kind of thing that Lawrence did was he had one guy, I don't recall his name right now. He's more of the comedic performer, so he would have like him on like a funny stage. The Halloween episode, he plays a wizard. And he's trying to, make himself look handsome. He does all these spells. There's a little bit of pyrotechniques, and he sings a song. And of course, his voice is incredible. And he's like a consummate performer. He's just hamming it up. And so that's a little bit skit-like, but still the focus is always on the music and Lawrence Welk. So if you're a music person, you're going to love it. And you don't want to challenge yourself too much, but you want to see really quality music. It's definitely worthwhile. Check it out on YouTube.
He was not part of the fast track, and I guess his success is a sign that there can be a Fred Rogers, there could be a Lawrence Welk, there could be good guys out there, and I don't know if you would say that they were exactly like they appeared, but I guess that's also something that, especially if you're into nostalgia, that could be interesting. I think we can segue here, and Chavah, stay with us if you don't mind. But when we talk about how television in the 70s wanted to become more edgy, and by the time 1975 came around, I think the only variety show was Carol Burnett. I think the other ones really all fell by the wayside. Maybe Flip Wilson was at 73 or 74, but all of them, they tried to be hip, they tried to continue. And I think Carol, went the longest. But what was interesting was another really supreme example of syndication, and it was out of the ITC network. I think Lord Guard, from out of London, was the Muppet Show. And that was something that I think Jim Henson and company, the Lou Guard and the Muppet organization said, we're going to just do this completely in syndication. And I think it really still is, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's the most successful syndicated program is the Muppet Show. And it really sort of shows you that the networks didn't want to take a chance on it. They didn't know if people were going to be interested. And the show itself is very much a shticky type of show. The show isn't, like you said, the Lawrence Welk show, where it's all filmed in one take. it's obviously spliced together with a tremendous amount of work to make it happen. A lot of trick photography and camera techniques. And I think one of the greatest accomplishments of the Muppet Show, we've talked about it before, is how they were able to incorporate guest stars into the program and to break the fourth wall and to have them come on. I talked a number of, I think last year, one of our earlier shows, I talked about Peter Ustinov and his incredible performance. And I mentioned to Yitzchak that so many of the performers on the Muppet Show don't get it. I mean, you can see that they were trying to bring someone popular into the show, but you can always tell there's something I saying, I'm really talking to a puppet. I mean, this is not real. And come on, you guys realize that these guys, these characters around me, they aren't really characters. There's somebody down there pulling their string and sticking their hands up here. But there were other characters like Ustinov and others who were able to seamlessly connect and sustain the illusion and still be part of that fun, that tongue-in-cheek, incredible fun. And just like Lawrence Welk, the Muppets also did a lot of popular songs, popular Beatles songs and other songs, and they would place them into this strange type of environment where there was a big joke about it, right? Like whether it was, they would take a song about, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and because it was, one of the, Dr. Teeth and one of his musicians, they were able to have the guitar start to cry or something like that, which of course you couldn't really do on a regular television program. The show I want to that somehow touched me. And I can't say that I did it with any great Solomonic wisdom, but I somehow, I had, and we're going to talk about Disney Plus in a minute, but I still have my subscription to Disney Plus where you can get all the Muppet shows, I think almost all of them. And season 4, which was 1980, they had Christopher Reeve on the show. And, Christopher Reeve, many people think he was just a one-trick pony. I know it's a terrible pun, considering the accident, the equestrian accident that paralyzed him for the rest of his life in the 90s, from 1995, I think, till his death in 2004. But he wasn't just Superman. He had a tremendous range. He was a graduate of Juilliard. He was in the same class with Robin Williams. John Houseman was his teacher, and he played in a number of Shakespearean-like roles. He was in Death Trap, the remake, but he did a very good job in that. A number of other period dramas that he was in. He really had quite a range, and I think this program, in a way, emphasizes what he was able to do. A tongue-in-cheek comedy, recognizing that he was this, hunky type of icon, but at the same time, clearly playing his own piano. When Miss Piggy breaks Rolf's fingers or does something with him, so he's not able to play, and he does a very fine singing voice, as well. And I think the skits really play off of the Superman persona, but at the same time, he really interacts wonderfully with all those Muppet performers, Miss Piggy specifically, but with Kermit as well. And to me, especially knowing how Christopher Reeve's life ended, and we always talk about giving meaning to your life, how he really became a Superman, a person who became an advocate, of course, for stem cell research, but also for what it was possible to do for a person who had become a paraplegic. The real Mesiras Nefesh that he had, the foundations that he created for research. He became much more religious, like many people do when they go through tragedies like he did. And he became a Unitarian and a believer in God and a believer in higher power. And knowing what happened to him, to me, it was a big musar to see him in his prime, to see him in his youth, to see him with Simcha in that program. So I think if you're looking for a Muppet episode to watch and to get a sense of, of that type of where variety shows went, I think it's a great option. As I said in the last couple of weeks, it goes down smooth, and it really, in a way, makes you interested in what other things that Christopher Reeve was able to appreciate. The fact that he was mostly a relative unknown in 1978 when he was chosen to have the title role in Superman. And of course, he didn't even get top billing, as you know. Brando gets top billing. I think even Gene Hackman might have gotten billing above them. These are two Great Academy Award-winning actors. Margot Kidder, of course, had been she had been in a number of films, Sisters and other things before that. She was somewhat known as well. And Christopher Reeve was the unknown. But to me, he steals that movie, not just because, of his aerodynamic ability, because he had been involved in gliding. So he knew all about, how to move his body in a way that those ropes and cables could make it appear as if he was actually flying. And remember, you guys are too young to remember this, but in 1978, when the movie came out, you will believe a man can fly. It was really the Salkin brothers, these Jewish guys who produced this film, Russian Jews who produced this film. They realized, that now was the time that a superhero movie could actually work. Up until now, as we've talked about, Yitzchak, we talked about last year in the Batman serial, right, where they're in like boxer shorts and they're like driving in a car. The Superman movie was really the beginning of what has now become almost, a craze, to the point that it's almost elbowed out all other types of films. But that first one with the John Williams score is really, tremendous. And Christopher Reeve made it work. You really not just believed a man could fly. You believed that this guy was Clark Kent. You believed he was Superman. He was so charming as Clark Kent. It wasn't, to me, George Reeves' role. He played him sort of as not as a bumbler. I read something today that Christopher Reeve said that he based his performance on Cary Grant's performance in Bringing Up Baby, which we mentioned last week. That's how we felt he was going to play.
Played Superman, the first live-action Superman on the screen. They actually, instead of having even the way that George Reeves, he flew by, you didn't see his feet, you didn't actually see him fly. The way they did it in 1948 was they actually had an animated cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
Like he changed from a human to an animated cartoon while he flew, which is kind of a funny way to do it. But I think actually the same year in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, they used the same effect for Bela Lugosi to turn into a bat on screen. So I think, that year, that was the year of trying this mix of 2D animation together with with live action in order to create.
Yeah, look, those serials. Those serials, whether it's versus the Monster Men or the Atomic, whatever it was,
Atom Man versus Superman.
Yeah, look, those were serials, and we've talked about the enjoyment of those. The Superman film is a completely different type of phenomenon. It's epic,
sure,
right? It really, it really reimagined the possibility, and for I know for the comic sales, everything took off. I mean, Christopher Reeve sold that character really, sort of the same way, in television. A couple years earlier, Linda Carter, was able to sell Wonder Woman. And again, to me, Christopher Reeve is a much better actor than Linda Carter was. I think Linda Carter is a beauty pageant winner. She was Miss World or whatever, the Miss World contestant, who happened to be able to to wear the bustier of Wonder Woman, and you can believe it's the same way she's drawn in the comics. With Christopher Reeve, he actually had to bulk up for the role. Part of the problem was he didn't have the muscles. And he had to actually bulk up and do weight lifts and build his body to a point that he could actually look like Superman in the costume. Unlike Michael Keaton, who wasn't any sort of muscular guy, when Michael Keaton put on the Batman costume, it was clear that the costume itself had sort of this, aspect of musculature that was built into the costume to make Batman seem more impressive. Whereas Christopher Reeve actually had to, go in those tights and fill them in a way that was heroic. Superman was, wholesome entertainment. You have to remember, I think once the rating code, and I'm telling to both the idiots and Chavah, once the rating code was jettisoned, it was like, oh, we can do this, Midnight Cowboy, let's go X, right? Almost every, it was like, hey, we haven't been able to do this for 50 years, since the Hays Code. So most of the 70s was like an explosion of nude scenes, right? Like, oh, we're going to go this. There's going to be a nude scene in The Godfather, a nude scene here, a nude scene there, and it was like, yeah, we can get away with it now. And I think towards the end of the 70s, they said we don't really need that. Again, there'll be definitely films that'll have nude scenes, but again, here we're going to have Superman, and and again, Star Wars, of course, right. At the same time. So you really have this idea of an epic that's clean and family centered. And there's people that'll tell you that Star Wars and maybe the Batman franchises are superior to Superman, but I can't think of a better performance. I mean, you can take Mark Hamill, maybe Alec Guinness, who's sort of slumming it. But you take Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, and Anthony Daniels, or even Michael Keaton or Jack Nicholson. Can you say that any of those performances top Christopher Reeve as Superman? I mean, I don't think so. I think Christopher Reeve really is the standout in terms of being true to the character. I think Michael Keaton had a sort of a crazy little, sort of like the way he played that role, sort of like Beetlejuice, like he wasn't there. But I think Christopher Reeve really deserves credit. He wasn't a one-trick pony, but I think he, in many ways, was the catalyst for Robert Downey Jr. and others who really, as you can see, lately have created quite they really burst forth on the scene. And, again, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I don't know how long it's going to last, but I think, Christopher Reeve is really the part.
When you mentioned SCTV, I thought of another one of Chavah's favorite shows that also somewhat lampooned the champagne music aspect was, what's the name of the show? With it's Martin Mull and Fernwood Tonight, and they had the orchestra, the house band was Happy Kine and the Mirth Makers, and that was also somewhat of a pastiche of that same style, but and they're very droll and not very mirthful. That was the Mirth Makers, and they never cracked a smile.
Happy kind of
one. Yeah.
I think if you can mention Fernwood Tonight, you have to mention its mother show, which is Mary Hartman, which I think is
for sure.
Yeah, Mary.
Time we could do a whole episode on Mary Hartman if you want.
Yeah, so Mary Hartman again, because I think Fernwood Tonight took some characters that were introduced on Mary Hartman and spun out. Again, Mary Hartman is an example again of able to have daily episodes just like a soap opera. We've talked about one of the wonderful episodes of Soap. Your husband and I have talked about Harold Gould. Star turn on Soap, where he plays Billy Crystal's roommate in the hospital. And I talked about Soap in general in that episode. And Soap deserves accolades too as vintage TV, but Soap could never have happened without Mary Hartman before it. And Mary Hartman, Soap was a weekly program. Mary Hartman for 2 years was a nightly program.
Yeah.
And again, it was really lampooning not only soap operas, but middle America life in ways that Roseanne is indebted to and some of these other programs. So definitely the best thing Louise Lasser ever did. Almost makes our 40-year cutoff, which is This Is Spinal Tap, which really, brought together a group of, it's Christopher Guest and Harry Shearer, and, Michael McKean, who is also very, very funny. And this is Spinal Tap, which is a mockumentary, about one of England's loudest bands, and it's all about bringing them back together. Of course, there is no such thing as Spinal Tap, but it really, completely satirized the whole rock scene, the aging rock stars, heavy metal in general, and also it was a total send up of documentaries, right? Because there were so many these serious documentaries. You had Martin Scorsese doing this documentary, The Last Waltz. You had Jonathan Demme doing a documentary film from the Talking Heads. So it made sense that it was time to send up rock stars, documentaries, and everything. And these guys are really, these guys are tremendous. That team, Guest, Shearer, Hank Azaria, Michael McKeon, Bob Balaban, and of course, they went on to make a number of wonderful satirical films, and then absorbing some of the old SCTV members as well. Fred Willard became part of that group as well. So they basically took so many of these Second City and other sort of comedy troupe comics that you've seen on television, but you don't know who they are exactly, and making these really spot on satirical films that are willing to really go where no other films are willing to go, willing to take risks. Whether it's A Mighty Wind, Best in Show, Waiting for Guffman, right? And I was talking to your husband today about one of our favorites, at least the favorite concept, which is For Your Consideration. Which Yitzchak, you said you've never been able to sit through the whole thing, but even the first 15 minutes, any self-respecting Jewish person has to really, collapse in belly laughs about what they're doing there, in terms of they're filming the ultimate Tennessee Williams type of drama piece of an old Jewish family in the 50s, with these actors, it's they're putting on a movie. They are producing a movie called Home for Purim, and I don't know if it's a great Purim pick. We got a couple of weeks to go to Purim, but I think
that's why I couldn't make it through, because I tried watching on Purim and then
maybe because you were drunk. I would say, but I think that satirical edge that they have, that was the power of SCTV and a lot of this other stuff, there was really no room for it on television anymore. Again, you have Saturday Night Live and these other programs that that are like hit and miss. I don't really know that much about Saturday Night Live past the 80s, but I get the sense that there wasn't much room for that anywhere else, and they've had that little platform to play with. I'm not sure exactly. Now they're already quite old, but I think it's really part of what I think the theme that we're talking about. Go independent. Let's go try to find something. Let's try to craft something. Again, I think Lawrence Welk would definitely would not applaud a lot of the stuff that troupe has done. But I think it shares a little bit of that same spirit, which is,
Absolutely, I totally agree.
We can be nonconformist, we can be different. We can have a type of humor that isn't just in the crotch football or something like that, or weepy, with Julia Roberts, crying over something, or some big chase. Again, it doesn't have any of that, and it's a shame. When you have some of those performers have to do things much more conventionally in order to make money. But I think that the Guest Shearer troupe is in a way sort of like the Pythons, We're going to do our thing, and we're going to push the envelope the way we see fit. They're not as villed as what Monty Python was about, but I think it's worthwhile, mentioning them as people with a vision. I mentioned how most Christmas films are difficult for Orthodox Jews to watch because there's a certain spiritual message that is tethered to the belief in Jesus or the belief in God that can only come about in sort of in a Christian way. And I mentioned how, that there are, of course, Christmas movies that don't have that element in it at all. They're settled around Christmas and they become sort of a Christmas film, but it isn't necessarily the spirit of Christmas or of Christ that takes it. In other words, they mention Christmas. There's a big Christmas tree. There's a Christmas song, a Christmas dance. There's carolers, but the program is really a ripoff. And I saw a movie that I had never seen before, and I knew it was called a Christmas classic, and that is Christmas in Connecticut. With Barbara Stanwyck and Dennis Morgan, who I mentioned a couple weeks ago with Jack Carson and Doris Day, and that film about It's a Great Feeling. Dennis Morgan is the male lead in this film. It was made right before the end of World War II, when it seemed that the Allied troops would win, and it's many people see it as, oh, we've got to watch that. That's one of our Christmas regulars. And as I was watching the film, I realized that this was an example of basically a sort of a screwball comedy setup, with a sort of mistaken identity. There's a Betty Crocker, Martha Stewart type of writer who's the star writer of a magazine for women, and it turns out that she's this incredible gourmet cook and of all these wonderful recipes. And it turns out, of course, that she's a fraud, that she gets the recipes from the Manhattan restaurant that's downstairs from her apartment, and she makes up the rest of the stuff based on her friend's house in Connecticut that she never really even goes to or knows about, but hears about from her friend, and the whole thing is a fiction. And that part is played by Barbara Stanwyck. Dennis Morgan plays the American a GI or a Marine or someone that was on some sort of a troop boat that gets torpedoed by a German U-boat. And by the way, in the beginning of the movie, it seems like you're watching a sort of a war film, because you actually have footage from some American war film, and you can see how the German commander, says, fire the torpedo, and you can see the boat go down, and he spends 16 days on a lifeboat, and then he needs to recover in a hospital, and his nurse decides to write a letter to this publisher in order to sort of like as a publicity and as a nice way, that let this GI, who's sort of a hero, be able to come and spend Christmas in Connecticut with this America's wonderful housekeeper in her farm in Connecticut. Of course, there is no farm really that she owns, and they have to somehow, she has to go up there. And part of it is very typical, a situation where you're not sure, are they going to discover that this whole thing is a farce and she doesn't know how to cook? And again, they fall in love, but the only way there was an agreement for her to go use this house in Connecticut was for her to marry the architect in Connecticut who's been pining after her all these years. So it's a Tanai that he'll do it, but they have to actually get married. And of course, that's part of the issue. There's a baby involved. There's another baby. So Christmas is really nothing to do with it, although it's happening during Christmas. It's not like the spirit of Christmas takes over. So I could recommend this film because it really, although there is a song that is sung by Dennis Morgan that's clearly some sort of reference to Bethlehem and peace and love, it's Christmas. It's not like Miracle on 34th Street. It's not like The Bishop's Wife. It's not even like It's a Wonderful Life. It really Christmas is incidental to the film. It could have been, over any sort of holiday. What I do want to mention, though, is that the supporting roles in the film is Show-S.Z.Sakall, otherwise known as Yaakov Grunwald. Cuddles, you know who I'm talking about, Yitzchak, of course. He was in so many films. He always plays, unlike other Hollywood actors that affected an accent, he was actually a Hungarian Jew who played in so many films, and they placed him in the Old West. I've mentioned him before. So it's Sakall's acting in this is quite funny. His usual type of malapropisms and other things that he says. And of course, he's the real cook. He's the one that knows. He plays the restaurant owner. He's the one who knows how to cook. And he's the one who doesn't understand English well and needs to be explained to him by his African-American fellow that works in his restaurant. So I can say that if you can watch this film and not be overwhelmed by the guilt of saying, "Oh, I'm enjoying a Christmas movie." It also has a performance that I thought was going to be terrible, but I have to say, I was very happy to watch of not only Sakall, who's quite a large fellow, but by a really large fellow, which is Sidney Greenstreet. He was in It's a Great Feeling as well with a cameo, but here he plays the magazine publisher, who the film indicates is estranged from his children and doesn't have anywhere to go for Christmas. He's sort of like a Scrooge-like character, but really not. And he comes up to spend Christmas there as well. And he sort of he's figuring out what's going on. So there's a lot of Sidney Greenstreet, being incredibly agile. I mean, the man weighed way over 300 pounds. And of course, he was, in the Maltese Falcon, in Casablanca. He started, John Huston discovered him, and his first film was when he was 62 years old. So I guess there's hope for Kivelevitz as well. 62 years old, he was in his first film in the Maltese Falcon. And he became a Hollywood icon, and almost like a team with Peter Lorre, as you know. You mentioned Peter Lorre last week, and it's worth seeing this film for Sakall. Barbara Stanwyck always acquits herself well. I don't think she ever puts in a bad performance. I think she's great as usual. But for the two fat guys, I think it's worth it. So, my friends, watch your step on the way out. Thanks a lot, Chavah, for joining us tonight. Keep those bubbles swirling around in your life.
And one and a two.
And a one. Right. Yes, and we'll be right. Enjoy. Be well, everybody. Take care. See you around.
Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.